April 19, 1945. A makeshift hospital in the small town of Hildesheim, Lower Saxony. As American forces pushed deeper into Nazi Germany, 23 female auxiliaries of the Wehrmacht huddled together in a dimly lit corner of what was once a school gymnasium, their eyes wide with terror at the sight of the dark-skinned medics entering the ward. They were certain these American soldiers would seek revenge for years of racial propaganda, never imagining that within days, these same men would become their most trusted protectors. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how Nazi indoctrination crumbled in the face of simple human compassion, and how the skilled hands of the segregated 332nd Medical Battalion rewrote the narrative of racial superiority, one saved life at a time. The morning air carried a biting chill as Haupthelferin Margarete Weber adjusted her grey uniform jacket, trying to appear composed, despite the chaos surrounding her. At 32, she had served as a senior auxiliary in the Wehrmacht's medical corps for nearly 4 years, managing communications and administrative duties that kept the German war machine functioning. Now on this overcast April morning, she stood among the ruins of what had once been an orderly German town, watching as American forces established control over Hildesheim. "Keep the women together, Fräulein Weber," ordered Oberleutnant Kraus, one of the few remaining German officers who had stayed with the auxiliary unit rather than fleeing eastward. "The Americans will process us soon. Remember your training. Name, rank, identification number only." Margaret nodded sharply, her blonde hair tightly secured beneath her service cap. "Yes, Herr Oberleutnant." She turned to the 22 women under her supervision, telephone operators, radio technicians, clerks, and nurses who had served at a nearby military hospital until American artillery had reduced it to rubble 3 days earlier. They had survived by taking shelter in the basement, emerging only when the distinctive rumble of American tanks had filled the streets. "Stand at attention," she commanded, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Whatever happens, show dignity. We are still representatives of the Reich." Even as she spoke the words, Margaret felt the hollowness behind them. The glorious 1,000-year Reich had lasted barely a decade before crumbling under the weight of Allied bombs and advancing armies. Their once proud unit had been reduced to a bedraggled collection of exhausted women with dirty uniforms and empty stomachs. Among the auxiliaries, 24-year-old Helferinnen Elsa Hoffmann clutched her small leather satchel containing her most precious possessions: a photograph of her family in Hamburg, a letter from her fiancé, who had disappeared on the Eastern Front in 1943, and her identification papers. Her round face, once cheerful and full, had grown gaunt over the long winter months of dwindling rations. "Will they shoot us, Margarete?" she whispered, breaking protocol by using her superior's first name, a sign of how thoroughly military discipline had collapsed. "Don't be ridiculous," Margaret replied sharply, though the same question had haunted her sleepless nights. "We are medical personnel protected under the Geneva Convention, but what if they're, 20-year-old Hannah Miller interjected, her voice dropping to barely audible levels. "The Americans with black skin?" A ripple of fearful murmurs spread through the assembled women. Throughout their service, they had been subjected to constant propaganda about the savage nature of America's Negro soldiers. Films, pamphlets, and officers' lectures had painted horrifying pictures of bestial men who would show no mercy, particularly to German women. "Silence," Margaret ordered. "We will conduct ourselves with discipline regardless of which Allied troops process us." Her words projected more confidence than she felt. In truth, Margaret shared many of the same fears. The Reich's propaganda had been relentless, and even as an educated woman, who had once harbored private doubts about some of the regime's more extreme claims, she found herself unable to completely dismiss the deeply ingrained warnings about the dangers posed by Negro soldiers. The sound of approaching vehicles silenced the group. 3 olive-drab ambulances bearing prominent red crosses pulled into the town square, followed by 2 transport trucks. German civilians peered anxiously from behind partially closed shutters as American soldiers jumped down from the vehicles, their uniforms notably different from the combat troops that had swept through the town the previous day. A tall white officer approached the German women, accompanied by a military interpreter. I am Captain Robert Montgomery, 352nd Medical Battalion, he announced as the interpreter translated. You will be processed as prisoners of war and provided medical attention if needed. Any who require immediate medical care should step forward now. None of the women moved, although several were suffering from minor injuries sustained during the artillery bombardment. The captain continued, You will be transported to a temporary holding facility at the school gymnasium 2 blocks from here. It has been converted to a medical station. Your wounded will receive treatment there. As the interpreter finished translating, the back doors of the ambulances opened, and several Negro soldiers in medical uniforms emerged, carrying stretchers and medical kits. Upon seeing them, Helferinnen Hannah Müller fainted dead away, collapsing into the arms of her companions. The reaction did not go unnoticed by the Americans. Captain Montgomery's expression hardened slightly, but he maintained his professional demeanor. Your companion will be attended to. The rest of you board the trucks in an orderly fashion. As 2 Negro medics approached with a stretcher, the German women shrank back, leaving the unconscious Hannah isolated on the ground. Margaret, feeling the weight of her responsibility, stepped forward. I will accompany her, she said stiffly to the interpreter. The medics, Sergeant James Washington and Corporal Marcus Taylor, exchanged glances but said nothing, as they efficiently lifted Hannah onto the stretcher. Sergeant Washington, a powerfully built man of 30 with closely cropped hair and intelligent eyes, had seen this reaction countless times since entering Germany. As a graduate of Howard University's pre-med program before the war, he had experienced American racism, but the visceral fear shown by Germans was something different, more primal, more complete in its dehumanization. She'll be fine, he said to Margaret through the interpreter as they loaded Hannah into the ambulance. Probably just shock and exhaustion. Margaret stared at him, surprised to hear such perfect accented English from a man she had been taught was barely more evolved than an animal. She quickly looked away, uncomfortable with the contradiction between what she had been told and what she was experiencing. The ride to the makeshift hospital took only minutes. The once stately school building had been largely spared from bombing, making it ideal for conversion to medical use. As they entered the gymnasium, Margaret was struck by the organized efficiency of the operation. Rows of cots lined the space, many already occupied by wounded German soldiers and civilians. American medical personnel moved purposefully among the patients, checking bandages, administering medications, and recording information on clipboards. Captain Montgomery directed the female auxiliaries to an area that had been partitioned off with hanging sheets for privacy. You'll be processed here, then assigned quarters. Any with medical training will be asked to assist with the wounded if they are willing. We're short-handed, and there are many in need. Margaret translated for the others, noting how many of the women kept their eyes fixed firmly on the floor, avoiding looking directly at the Negro medical personnel who comprised the majority of the staff. The fear was palpable, a living thing that seemed to pulse among them with each passing minute. First Lieutenant Richard Carter approached the group of German women, his dark skin contrasting sharply with the white coat he wore over his uniform. At 35, he was one of the few Negro physicians who had managed to secure an officer's commission, despite the Army's reluctance to place black men in positions of authority. A graduate of Meharry Medical College, he had maintained a small practice in Philadelphia before the war. Captain Montgomery suggested I perform initial health assessments, he said to the interpreter. Please inform them that I am a licensed physician and will conduct brief examinations to identify any who need immediate care. When this was translated, several of the German women began to protest vehemently. Absolutely not, declared Brunhilde Keller, a 40-year-old senior nurse who had been with the Wehrmacht since before the war. We refuse to be touched by. She struggled for a word that the interpreter would translate, finally settling on, by them. Lieutenant Carter had encountered such reactions before and maintained his professional demeanor. Please inform them that female nurses will be present during all examinations and they may keep their clothing on. I'm only checking for signs of malnutrition, exposure, or untreated injuries. The standoff continued until Margaret, seeing the futility of resistance in their current situation, stepped forward. I will go first, she announced to her stunned compatriots. "We are prisoners now, and we have wounded among us who need care." Followed by the female American nurse, Margaret entered a screened-off area where Lieutenant Carter waited with his medical kit. His movements were methodical and entirely professional as he checked her pulse, listened to her breathing, examined her eyes, and noted the condition of her skin and extremities. "You're suffering from mild malnutrition and exhaustion," he stated matter-of-factly as the interpreter translated. "Not uncommon given the conditions. I'm recommending additional rations and rest for the next 48 hours. Margaret studied him as he made notes in her newly created medical file. His hands were steady, his demeanor calm and focused. Nothing about his behavior matched the animalistic caricatures from propaganda minister Goebbels's vicious films. "Thank you, doctor," she said stiffly, the words feeling strange in her mouth. Over the next hour, the remaining women were examined, with Margaret's example giving them little choice but to comply. 5 were found to need more extensive medical care. Hannah for her continuing dizzy spells, 2 others for shrapnel wounds they had been hiding, and 2 more for severe bronchial infections that had gone untreated. As they settled into their assigned area of the gymnasium that evening, the German women whispered among themselves, trying to reconcile their expectations with their experience. "Did you see how clean they keep everything?" Elsa murmured to Margarete. "The Reich hospitals haven't had such supplies in over a year." "That doesn't mean anything," Brunhilde interjected sharply. "America has resources, that's all. They haven't had their cities bombed to rubble." "The doctor seemed knowledgeable," ventured another woman hesitantly. "He knew immediately what was wrong with my arm." Brunhilde snorted. "They're following orders from their white officers. Don't be fooled. You've all seen the educational films. You know what they're capable of when left unsupervised." Margaret said nothing, her mind troubled by the contradictions between what she had been taught and what she had observed. As a former teacher before the war, she had prided herself on her critical thinking, yet had accepted the regime's racial theories without much question. Now uncertainty crept into her thoughts like fog, obscuring what had once seemed clear. As the women tried to sleep on their narrow cots, the sounds of the hospital continued around them. Moans from the wounded, the squeak of rubber-soled shoes on the wooden floor, the murmur of medical staff consulting in hushed tones. Through a gap in the partitioning sheets, Margaret could see Sergeant Washington and another Negro medic gently changing bandages on an elderly German civilian woman, their manner respectful and careful. Just before dawn, their uneasy rest was shattered by the arrival of a convoy of ambulances. Shouts in English and the squeal of brakes announced a new influx of wounded. The partitions around the women's section were suddenly pulled aside. "We need this space," announced a harried white nurse. A field hospital near the front was shelled. "We have incoming wounded, many in critical condition." Captain Montgomery appeared, his uniform stained and his face drawn with exhaustion. "We're converting this entire facility to critical care," he told the interpreter to relay. "The female POWs who are able-bodied will be transported to the secondary holding facility at the church hall. Those with medical training who are willing to assist will be permitted to remain and help." Brunhilde immediately stepped forward. Despite her prejudices, she was a nurse first, and the idea of abandoning wounded, particularly German wounded, was anathema to her. "I will stay," she declared. "I was head surgical nurse at Charité Hospital in Berlin before the war." 4 other German nurses also volunteered, along with Margaret, who had received basic medical training as part of her role supervising female auxiliaries. "Very well," Captain Montgomery nodded. "Lieutenant Carter will direct you. Follow his instructions precisely. This is not a time for any nonsense. A time." The gymnasium rapidly transformed around them as the less critically wounded were moved to make space for the new arrivals. The first stretchers began arriving moments later, bearing broken bodies of both German and American soldiers caught in the same artillery barrage. Lieutenant Carter moved with calm efficiency, triaging patients and directing them to different treatment areas. "Fräulein Weber," he called through the interpreter, "assist Sergeant Washington with those 3. He pointed to a group of newly arrived stretchers bearing young German soldiers, none who appeared older than 20. Margaret followed Sergeant Washington to the indicated patients. The young men's field grey uniforms were soaked with blood, their faces ashen under layers of dirt and camouflage paint. "These three were in a forward observation post when it took a direct hit," explained the American medic who had brought them in. "They surrendered to our advancing units just before the Soviet artillery opened up on both positions. Probable internal bleeding, definite concussive injuries, shrapnel wounds." Sergeant Washington immediately began cutting away the uniform of the most severely injured soldier, exposing a torso mottled with bruising and penetrating wounds. "Pneumothorax," he diagnosed quickly, identifying a collapsed lung. "I need a chest tube kit." He glanced at Margaret. "Can you start an IV while I prepare the insertion site?" Margaret hesitated only briefly before nodding and reaching for the indicated supplies. As a senior auxiliary, she had assisted enough field medics to know the basics of intravenous insertion. The young German soldier stared up at her with pain-clouded eyes as she prepared his arm. "It will be all right," she told him in German. "These doctors will help you." The soldier's gaze shifted to Sergeant Washington, and alarm flashed across his features. "Nein," he gasped, weakly trying to pull away. "Nicht. Nicht ihr." "Be still," Margarete commanded him sharply. "This man is trying to save your life." Working together, she and Sergeant Washington stabilized the young soldier, inserting the tube that would reinflate his collapsed lung and administering plasma and morphine. Throughout the procedure, Washington explained each step, his knowledge evident in every precise movement. "How long have you been a medic?" Margaret found herself asking through the interpreter, who circulated among the treatment teams. "I was a third-year medical student when Pearl Harbor happened," he replied without looking up from his work. "Enlisted the next day. The Army wasn't putting many of us through medical school then, so I became a combat medic instead." Margaret absorbed this information in silence as they moved to the next patient. Throughout the chaotic night, she witnessed the Negro medical personnel performing procedures she had previously only seen conducted by Germany's most experienced physicians. Lieutenant Carter performed emergency surgery on a German officer with a skill that even Brunhilde, watching from another treatment station, could not deny. By morning, the crisis had stabilized. Of the 37 critically wounded soldiers who had arrived during the night, 32 were still alive, a survival rate that would have been remarkable in even the best German military hospitals during the height of the Reich's power. Exhausted, Margarete slumped onto a vacant stool, watching as Sergeant Washington finally took a brief break, accepting a cup of coffee from another medic. "Your people saved many German lives tonight," she said when the interpreter came near. Sergeant Washington sipped his coffee before answering. "They're just lives to us, ma'am. We don't see uniforms when we're working." This simple statement struck Margaret with unexpected force. Throughout her years in the Wehrmacht auxiliary, she had been surrounded by the Reich's racial ideology, the constant emphasis on German blood, on the superiority of the Aryan race, on the subhuman nature of those deemed Untermenschen. Yet here was evidence that contradicted everything she had been taught. Over the next several days, a peculiar routine developed. The German female auxiliaries who had volunteered to help were integrated into the hospital's workflow, always under supervision, but increasingly trusted with more responsibilities as they demonstrated their competence. The initial terror that had gripped many of them began to fade, replaced by professional respect born of shared purpose. Brunhilde Keller, despite her initial hostility, found herself working closely with Lieutenant Carter on several complex cases. A woman who had once nodded in agreement at lectures detailing the inherent intellectual inferiority of non-Aryans now consulted with a Negro physician on treatment protocols. "Your suturing technique is excellent," she grudgingly admitted on the third day, watching as he closed a wound with nearly invisible stitches. "Thank you," he replied simply. "I had a good teacher at Meharry." Meharry? Meharry Medical College, in Nashville, Tennessee, one of the few places that trained Negro physicians before the war. Brunhilde hesitated, then asked the question that had been troubling her. "How many years did your training require?" 4 years of undergraduate study, then 4 years of medical school, followed by internship, he answered. "Same as any other doctor in America, though our facilities weren't as well funded as the white institutions. This directly contradicted what she had been taught about the intellectual capacity of non-Aryans, who supposedly lacked the ability for advanced abstract thinking required for medical training. Rather than confront this contradiction directly, Brunhilde retreated into her professional role, focusing on the patients rather than the implications of what she was learning. Meanwhile, Elsa Hoffmann had been assigned to assist in the convalescent ward, where less critically injured patients were recovering. Working alongside Corporal Marcus Taylor, a former schoolteacher from Detroit, who had trained as a medic after being denied officer candidacy due to his race, she helped change dressings, administer medications, and provide basic care to wounded German soldiers. On her fourth day, she was startled when a young Wehrmacht private grasped her hand as she adjusted his blanket. "Fräulein," he whispered urgently, "you must help me. These Negro soldiers, when I sleep, they—" He trailed off, his eyes darting fearfully toward where Corporal Taylor was checking another patient's chart. "They what?" Elsa asked, leaning closer. "Last night, I pretended to sleep," the soldier continued in a hushed voice. "I saw one of them take extra bandages from the supply cabinet and hide them. They're stealing. Who knows what else they plan to do?" Elsa straightened, troubled by the accusation. She had been raised in the Hitler Youth and educated under the Reich's curriculum, which had emphasized the criminal nature of those designated as racial inferiors. The soldier's claim aligned with everything she had been taught to expect. Later that evening, she deliberately lingered in the ward, watching Corporal Taylor as he completed his rounds. After most of the patients had fallen asleep, she observed him doing exactly what the German soldier had described, taking extra bandages from the supply cabinet and placing them in a bag under a desk. Gathering her courage, Elsa approached him. "I saw what you did," she said through the interpreter who remained on duty for night shifts. "Why are you stealing supplies?" Taylor looked startled, then understanding dawned on his face. "I'm not stealing anything," he replied calmly. "Come with me." Reluctantly, Elsa followed him to a small side room off the main ward. Inside, a young German girl of about 8 sat on a cot, her leg wrapped in an improvised splint. Beside her, an elderly woman who appeared to be her grandmother kept anxious watch. "This is Greta and her grandmother, Frau Schmidt," Taylor explained. "They've been hiding in the basement of a bombed building 3 blocks from here. One of our patrol units found them yesterday. The little girl has a fracture, but not severe enough to warrant a bed in our main wards given the current casualties." As Corporal Taylor gently began changing the girl's bandages, Elsa realized that he had been secretly caring for civilians who weren't officially admitted to the overwhelmed hospital. "Why didn't you report them for proper admission?" she asked. Taylor glanced at her. "Because the captain would have had to send them to the civilian displacement camp outside town, and they would have been separated. The grandmother refused to leave the girl, and the girl needs medical attention for at least another week. So a few of us have been taking turns checking on them." The little girl smiled shyly at Taylor as he finished rewrapping her leg, then reached into his pocket and produced a small piece of chocolate, which he gave to her. "Danke," Greta said softly. "Bitte schön," Taylor replied in heavily accented German, one of the few phrases he had learned. Watching this interaction, Elsa felt a growing sense of dissonance. This was not what Reich propaganda had prepared her to expect from America's Negro soldiers. As they left the room, Elsa found herself asking, "How did you learn to be a medic?" "I was a high school science teacher before the war," Taylor replied. "When I joined up, they tested us, and I scored high enough for medic training. Wanted to be an officer, but they weren't taking many colored men for OCS back then, no matter the test scores." The fact that he had been a teacher, a profession Elsa herself had aspired to before the war interrupted her education, further complicated her understanding. The simple categories of Reich racial theory were proving inadequate to explain the complexity of the people she was encountering. By the end of the first week, subtle but significant changes had occurred among the German women. The physical distance they maintained from the Negro medical personnel had decreased. Conversations, initially conducted only through interpreters and restricted to necessary medical communication, had expanded to include questions about training, background, and even cautious inquiries about life in America. This evolving dynamic was noticed by Captain Montgomery, who discussed it with Lieutenant Carter as they reviewed patient charts late one evening. "They're beginning to see you as people," Montgomery observed. "It's a start, anyway." Carter's expression remained neutral. "It won't last. Once they're transferred to a permanent POW facility, they'll revert to what they've been taught. A week of working together doesn't undo years of indoctrination." "Don't underestimate the power of direct experience, Richard," Montgomery replied. "Some of them, at least, are asking questions they never considered before." Lieutenant Carter allowed himself a small smile. "Maybe." "Speaking of questions, Brunhilde, the senior German nurse, asked me today if I thought Negro doctors would be allowed to practice in white hospitals after the war. Seemed genuinely curious about the answer." "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That I hope so, but I'm not counting on it." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a military police officer, his expression grave. "Captain Montgomery, message from headquarters. We've got a situation developing at the Western checkpoint. A German medical transport with wounded was trying to reach the hospital in Hanover when it was caught in crossfire. They've diverted here, but we've got multiple critical cases incoming, including pregnant women from a maternity ward that was evacuated." Montgomery immediately set aside his paperwork. "How many incoming?" "At least 20 critical, another 30 walking wounded. ETA 15 minutes. Alert all staff and clear as many beds as possible," Montgomery ordered. "Any stable patients need to be moved to the secondary facility immediately." As the police officer departed, Montgomery turned to Carter. "This is going to push us beyond capacity. We'll need everyone, including those German nurses and auxiliaries. Can they handle it?" Carter nodded. "They're good at their jobs, whatever else they may be, especially Brunhilde and Margarete." The next hour was a flurry of activity as the hospital prepared for the new arrivals. Stable patients were quickly transferred, additional surgical stations were set up, and all personnel, American and German alike, were assigned to emergency response teams. Margarete found herself working with Sergeant Washington again, preparing a triage area near the entrance. Despite her exhaustion from the long days of work, she moved with purpose, organizing supplies with practiced efficiency. "You've done this before, Juan," Washington observed as they arranged intravenous stands. "Many times more," Margaret replied through the interpreter. "First in Poland, then France, later behind the Eastern Front. The locations change, but the work remains the same." Washington nodded. "War has its own universal language." The sound of approaching vehicles ended their conversation. The first patients were being unloaded. German military medical personnel in field grey uniforms stained with blood, accompanying stretchers bearing civilians and soldiers alike. A German medical officer, his own arm in a makeshift sling, approached the entrance, his expression shifting from relief to shock as he registered the presence of Negro medical personnel. He immediately sought out Captain Montgomery, who was directing the incoming cases. "Herr Captain," he began in halting English, "I must protest. These patients cannot be treated by—" Montgomery cut him off. "Doctor, we have critical patients arriving. This is not the time for your prejudices. My medical personnel are among the best trained in the European theatre, and right now they're your wounded's best chance at survival. Assist or step aside." The German officer stiffened, clearly conflicted between his indoctrinated beliefs and his medical oath. The decision was made for him, as the first truly critical case was carried in, a pregnant woman in active labor, bleeding heavily, accompanied by a distraught German nurse. "Placental abruption," the nurse reported frantically in German, which was quickly translated. "Began during the artillery barrage. She's fully dilated but losing too much blood." Lieutenant Carter immediately took charge, directing the woman to the makeshift delivery area that had been established in anticipation of the maternity cases. "I need Brunhilde and an additional nurse," he called out. "Blood and plasma standing by. Prepare for possible emergency cesarean." The German medical officer watched in stunned silence as the Negro physician confidently issued orders that were immediately obeyed by both American and German medical staff. His own training and instincts as a doctor ultimately overrode his ideological reservations. "I will assist," he said to Montgomery, removing his sling. "My arm can wait." The next several hours tested the limits of both the facility and its personnel. 3 emergency surgeries were conducted simultaneously. Sergeant Washington and Margaret worked seamlessly together, stabilizing the most critical patients before transferring them to the appropriate treatment areas. Elsa and Corporal Taylor managed the less severely injured, efficiently categorizing them by urgency and required care. In the delivery area, Lieutenant Carter faced a life-threatening crisis as the pregnant woman's condition deteriorated rapidly. The baby was in distress, the mother hemorrhaging. With Brunhilde assisting, he performed an emergency cesarean delivery, his movements swift and precise despite the suboptimal conditions. When the infant girl was safely delivered, not breathing at first but responding to resuscitation efforts, Carter immediately turned his attention to stopping the mother's hemorrhaging. The German medical officer, Dr. Klaus Weber, no relation to Margaret, who had been observing and assisting, found himself impressed by the Negro physician's skill. "You have saved both mother and child," he acknowledged quietly as they completed the procedure. "I would not have attempted the vascular repair technique you used." "It's relatively new," Carter explained as they worked. "Developed at Howard University Hospital in '42. I observed it during my training and have used it 6 times in field conditions." The German doctor nodded thoughtfully. Perhaps there are medical advances I am not familiar with." By dawn, the crisis had once again been weathered. Of the 53 new patients who had arrived, 50 had survived the night, including all of the pregnant women and new mothers from the evacuated maternity ward. The German medical personnel who had accompanied the transport had been integrated into the hospital staff, initially with reluctance, but gradually with increasing cooperation, as the focus remained firmly on patient care rather than nationality or race. The exhausted staff finally took breaks in rotation, grabbing coffee and rations whenever possible. Margareta found herself seated at a makeshift break table across from Sergeant Washington, too tired to maintain the distance she would have kept just days earlier. "You performed well under pressure," he commented, offering her a cigarette, which she accepted. "Military hospitals are always short-handed. You'd have made a good full-fledged nurse with proper training." "I was studying to be a teacher before the war," Margaret replied, surprising herself with the personal disclosure. "Literature and languages." "College education?" "Yes, at Heidelberg. I completed 3 years before." She trailed off, the weight of all that had happened since those pre-war days suddenly overwhelming. Washington seemed to understand her unspoken thoughts. "War interrupts everything. I was halfway through medical school myself." "You will go back after?" Margaret asked. He shrugged. "If I can. Money was tight before, might be tighter after, depending on how things go. Not too many hospitals where I'm from that take Negro doctors, and those that do can't always pay much." This reality, that even in America, opportunities were limited based on race, didn't align with either Nazi propaganda, which portrayed American Negroes as privileged and dangerous, or with American propaganda, which emphasized freedom and opportunity for all. The complexity of the true situation made Margaret uncomfortably aware of how simplified her worldview had been. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of more senior officers, a full colonel, accompanied by 2 majors from division headquarters. They requested a meeting with Captain Montgomery and his senior staff. When the meeting concluded an hour later, Montgomery called the German nurses and auxiliaries together. "There's been a change of plans," he announced through the interpreter. "Division headquarters is converting this facility into a longer-term regional hospital for both military personnel and civilians. The front has moved eastward, and this location has been designated as a medical coordination center for the sector." He paused, looking at the assembled women. "Those of you with medical training are being offered the opportunity to remain here as civilian medical assistants rather than being transferred to a POW camp. You would work under the supervision of our medical staff, but would receive standard rations and a small stipend. This is entirely voluntary." The German women exchanged glances, surprised by this unexpected development. Brunhilde stepped forward. "What would be our status? Would we still be considered prisoners?" "Technically, yes," Montgomery replied, "but you would have more privileges than in a standard POW facility. You would be housed in supervised quarters near the hospital rather than in a camp. And you would be performing the medical duties you're trained for, rather than whatever labor assignments might be given in a POW setting. For many of the women, the decision was simple. Working as nurses, even under American supervision, was preferable to an uncertain future in a prisoner camp. 13 immediately volunteered to stay, including Brunhilde, who had come to respect the American medical operation despite her lingering prejudices. Margaret hesitated, her gaze meeting Sergeant Washington's across the room. The past week had fundamentally challenged beliefs she had held for years. Working alongside these men, seeing their skill, their professionalism, their simple humanity, had created fissures in the foundation of her worldview. "I will stay," she decided. Elsa also chose to remain, along with 3 other auxiliaries who had been assisting in various capacities. 6 women opted to be transferred to the POW facility, either out of continued ideological commitment or fear of being seen as collaborators by their fellow Germans. The transition to the new arrangement was not without challenges. As the hospital expanded its operations, taking over adjacent buildings to accommodate more patients, tensions occasionally flared between newly arriving German patients and the Negro medical personnel. Some refused treatment outright until they saw German nurses working alongside the American medics, which often helped ease their fears. 3 weeks into this new arrangement, an incident occurred that would profoundly affect the German women who had stayed. A convoy of vehicles arrived without warning, bearing wounded SS officers and soldiers who had been captured after a fierce battle near the Elbe River. Unlike the regular Wehrmacht personnel who comprised most of the German military patients, these SS men were fanatical Nazi party members, many bearing the blood-type tattoos that marked them as part of the elite force. As they were brought into the triage area, one officer, an Obersturmführer with a severe but not life-threatening leg wound, became agitated at the sight of Sergeant Washington preparing to examine him. "Untermenschen," he spat, recoiling. "I will not be touched by an animal. Where are the real doctors?" The interpreter, weary of such scenes, translated flatly. Sergeant Washington, who had heard similar slurs countless times, simply moved on to the next patient, his face revealing nothing. Margaret, who was assisting with intake, felt an unexpected surge of anger. "He is a skilled medic who has saved dozens of German lives," she said sharply to the SS officer in German. "You would be fortunate to receive his care." The officer's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You," he hissed, "are a race traitor. When Germany rises again, collaborators like you will be dealt with first." Before Margaret could respond, Lieutenant Carter intervened. "Sergeant, move on to the next patient. Fräulein Weber, please assist Corporal Taylor with the burn cases that just arrived." The SS officer was eventually treated by one of the white American physicians, but the incident cast a shadow over the hospital. The German women who had chosen to stay found themselves increasingly ostracized by the more fanatical German patients, particularly as more SS personnel arrived. That evening, Margaret found herself unable to sleep in the women's quarters. The SS officer's words echoed in her mind, not because they frightened her, the Reich was clearly finished, but because they forced her to confront how thoroughly she had once accepted similar views herself. Seeking fresh air, she stepped outside into the hospital's small courtyard, surprised to find Sergeant Washington already there, smoking thoughtfully as he gazed up at the stars. He nodded acknowledgement of her presence but said nothing. After a moment of awkward silence, Margaret spoke. "I want to apologize for what happened today. The way that officer spoke to you was unforgivable." Washington exhaled a stream of smoke before answering. "No need to apologize for him. You're not responsible for what he believes." "But I am responsible for what I believed," Margaret replied quietly. "And until recently I believed many of the same things." Washington studied her face in the moonlight. "What changed?" Margaret considered the question carefully. Seeing contradicted hearing. "For years, we were told what your people were like. Savage, unintelligent, dangerous. But watching you work, seeing your skill, your dedication, it didn't match what we had been told, and once that contradiction appeared, other questions followed." She hesitated, then continued. "The Reich told us so many things with such certainty, about Jewish people, about Slavs, about the superiority of German blood. What if those were also untrue? What if everything we sacrificed for, everything Germany has suffered for, was based on lies? Washington was silent for a long moment before responding. People believe what's convenient, what makes them feel special or safe. It's the same in America. Plenty of white folks back home would be just as shocked to see me in a medical uniform as your people are. They've got their stories about what Negroes can and can't do, and they don't let facts get in the way. How do you bear it? Margaret asked. The way people look at you, the things they say? He shrugged. You develop thick skin, focus on the work, on the people you can help, and you hope that maybe, just maybe, someone's mind might change when they see you as a person instead of an idea. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Elsa, who appeared distressed. Margaret, she said urgently, you must come. There's trouble in the women's quarters. Margaret and Washington followed Elsa to the converted classroom where the German female staff were housed. Inside, they found Brunhilde engaged in a heated argument with two other nurses who had recently arrived with the SS transport. Disgusting betrayal of everything the fatherland stands for, one of the new nurses was saying as they entered, working alongside Untermenschen, treating them as equals. Have you no shame? I am a nurse first, Brunhilde replied firmly. These physicians and medics are highly trained professionals. I have seen their work with my own eyes. Brainwashed, spat the second newcomer, or perhaps you enjoy their company. Is that it? The Führer warned us about women who would betray their race for— Enough, Margaret interjected, her voice cutting through the tension. This is a medical facility, not a political rally. Your outdated ideology has no place here. The two new nurses turned on her. You're the worst of them, the first accused. We've heard how you work with that Negro sergeant, as if he were your equal. He is my equal in this hospital, Margaret responded, surprised by her own vehemence. In medical knowledge, he is my superior. I suggest you focus on your patient's welfare rather than on who provides their care. The confrontation might have escalated further if Sergeant Washington had not cleared his throat from the doorway. Excuse me, but Captain Montgomery is requesting all medical personnel. We have new arrivals. The new nurses fell silent at his appearance, but their glares made their feelings clear. As everyone filed out to respond to the call, Margaret found herself walking alongside Brunhilde. Thank you for defending me, Brunhilde said quietly. I never thought I would find myself arguing in defense of them. Nor did I, Margaret admitted. Yet here we are. The new arrivals turned out to be something none of them had anticipated, a transport of liberated concentration camp survivors discovered by advancing American troops and evacuated to the nearest medical facility, capable of treating their extreme malnutrition and diseases. The sight of these skeletal figures being gently carried into the hospital shocked even the most hardened medical personnel. Many of the survivors wore the striped uniforms of camp inmates, now hanging from emaciated frames. Others were dressed in scraps of civilian clothing. All bore the unmistakable signs of prolonged starvation and abuse. Among the German staff, the reaction was profound. Many had heard rumors of the camps, but had dismissed them as enemy propaganda. Some had genuinely believed that such facilities were merely work camps or detention centers for criminals. Now, faced with the physical evidence of systematic cruelty, they could no longer maintain such comfortable illusions. Elsa turned away, physically ill at the sight of a teenage boy so thin that every bone was visible beneath his skin. Brunhilde, professional as always, set aside her shock to begin assessing the survivors, but tears streamed silently down her face as she worked. For Margaret, the moment marked another fracture in her already crumbling worldview. If the Reich had lied so comprehensively about racial differences, what other horrors had been hidden behind patriotic slogans and stirring speeches about German destiny? The medical team worked through the night to stabilize the survivors, many of whom were critically ill with typhus, tuberculosis, and complications of starvation. The Negro medics showed the same care and professionalism with these patients as they had with all others. Despite the fact that many were Jewish, another group the Reich had classified as Untermenschen. In the days that followed, the hospital staff, both American and German, established a grim new routine centered on the specialized care needed by the camp survivors. Refeeding had to be done carefully to prevent potentially fatal complications. Infectious diseases required isolation and intensive treatment. Psychological trauma manifested in ways that challenged even the most experienced caregivers. Throughout this difficult period, the working relationships between the German women and the Negro medical personnel deepened further. United by the common purpose of saving lives and alleviating suffering, they developed a professional rapport that transcended the ideological barriers that had once separated them. 6 weeks after the arrival of the first camp survivors, Captain Montgomery called a meeting of all hospital staff. The war in Europe had officially ended, he announced, with Germany's unconditional surrender signed on May 8th. The hospital would continue operations during the occupation, but changes in personnel were inevitable, as some American units would be redeployed to the Pacific Theater. The 382nd Medical Battalion will be rotating back to England next month, he informed them. A regular Army medical unit will replace us here. Those of you who are German nationals working as civilian medical staff will continue in your current roles if you wish. The news was met with mixed reactions. For the Negro medical personnel, returning to England meant one step closer to eventually going home to America. Yet many had formed professional bonds with their German colleagues and patients that they were reluctant to sever. For the German women, the departure of the 392nd represented an uncertain future. Would the replacement medical unit treat them with the same professional respect? Would they maintain the efficient systems that Lieutenant Carter and Sergeant Washington had established? And on a more personal level, how would they reconcile their transformed understanding with a return to German society? In the final days before the 382nd's departure, Margaret found herself working alongside Sergeant Washington to complete medical records and transition plans for their patients. The easy rhythm of their cooperation bore little resemblance to the fearful distance she had maintained just 2 months earlier. "What will you do when you return to America?" she asked during a rare quiet moment. "Apply to medical school again." "If I can find the money," he replied. "The GI Bill should help. Finish what I started." "You will be an excellent physician," Margaret said with certainty. "Your patients will be fortunate." Washington smiled slightly. "If they'll have me. Still plenty of hospitals back home that don't take Negro doctors or Negro patients for that matter." Margaret frowned. "But after all you've done in the war, surely that will change things?" "Maybe. Hope so. But change comes slow, especially when people are invested in keeping things the way they are." His words resonated with Margaret's own experience of how deeply people could hold on to beliefs even in the face of contradicting evidence. The Reich's racial ideologies had not developed overnight, nor would they disappear immediately despite Germany's defeat. On the evening before the 382nd's departure, Captain Montgomery arranged a small ceremony to recognize the contributions of both American and German medical personnel who had worked together under such extraordinary circumstances. Certificates of appreciation were presented, simple but meaningful acknowledgments of the lives saved through their collective efforts. Lieutenant Carter, who had been promoted to captain in recognition of his service, addressed the assembled staff. "When we arrived in Hildesheim, we encountered fear and distrust on both sides. That was to be expected given the circumstances. What was not expected, at least by me, was how quickly professional respect could overcome personal prejudice when people of goodwill focus on a common purpose." He looked directly at Brunhilde, Margaret, Elsa, and the other German women who had chosen to stay and work alongside them. "You have taught me that minds can change when hearts are open. That is a lesson I will carry home with me, and one I hope you will share with your countrymen as Germany rebuilds." The following morning, as the 382nd prepared to depart, farewells were exchanged with surprising emotion. Brunhilde, who had once refused to be examined by a Negro physician, now shook Lieutenant Carter's hand with genuine respect. "I have learned more from you than medical techniques," she told him. "I have learned to question what I thought I knew with certainty." Elsa embraced Corporal Taylor, thanking him for his patience in teaching her advanced first aid skills. Other German nurses and auxiliaries expressed similar sentiments to the medics they had worked alongside. As Sergeant Washington loaded his gear onto the transport truck, Margaret approached him with a small package. "A token of appreciation," she said, handing it to him, "and of apology. Inside the carefully wrapped package was a textbook, Lehrbuch der Inneren Medizin, a comprehensive German medical text that had been standard in German medical schools before the war. Inside the cover, Margaret had inscribed a message in her neat handwriting to Sergeant James Washington, whose skilled hands saved German lives, while his quiet dignity changed German minds. May your healing work continue long after the wounds of war have healed. With gratitude and respect, Margarete Weber. Washington traced his fingers over the inscription, visibly moved. Thank you, this will be useful when I return to my studies. You will write when you are accepted to medical school, Margaret asked. Our hospital will need to establish connections with American medical institutions as Germany rebuilds. Professional correspondence would be appropriate. Washington understood the offer behind her carefully chosen words, a continuing human connection across the divisions that the war had both created and, in their case, unexpectedly bridged. I'll write, he promised. The hospital administrator can forward your letters. As the convoy of vehicles departed the hospital grounds, Margaret stood with the other German staff, watching until the last truck disappeared from view. The American flag still flew over the hospital and would continue to do so throughout the occupation. But the 332nd Medical Battalion, the unit that had arrived as feared enemies and departed as respected colleagues, was gone. Later that evening, Margaret sat alone in the small office she now shared with Brunhilde, who had been appointed lead nurse under the new American Medical Administration. On her desk lay the personnel file she had been asked to complete for the occupation authorities, a document that would determine her status and employment under the new German government being established in the American zone. The form included a section on political affiliations. Margarete had never joined the Nazi Party, but like most Germans working in government or military positions, she had been required to participate in party-affiliated organizations and had never openly opposed Reich policies, including its racial doctrines. How could she explain the transformation in her thinking? How could a form capture the journey from fear to respect, from propaganda-induced hatred to human connection? In the end, she wrote simply, I have learned that character cannot be determined by race, that skill and compassion know no color, and that the truest measure of any person lies not in their appearance, but in their actions. I pledge to bring this understanding to my work in rebuilding a Germany free from the poisonous ideologies that led us to destruction. Whether such a statement would help or hinder her prospects under occupation authorities, she could not know. But it was the truth, as she now understood it, forged in the crucible of direct experience that had shattered a lifetime of indoctrination. Over the following months and years, the German women who had worked with the 332nd Medical Battalion would carry their transformed understanding into a Germany struggling to rebuild not only its cities, but its moral compass. Some, like Brunhilde, would face ostracism from former colleagues who considered them collaborators. Others, like Elsa, would incorporate their experiences into their teaching when educational systems were re-established. Margaret herself would eventually return to education, completing her degree and becoming a teacher in the new democratic Germany. When teaching history, she would share her personal testimony of how direct experience had proven more powerful than ideology, how working alongside people she had been taught to fear had revealed the humanity they shared. And in Philadelphia, Dr. James Washington, who completed his medical degree in 1948, despite facing continued racial barriers, would occasionally share with his students a similar lesson, illustrated by the German medical textbook he kept prominently displayed in his office, with its inscription that reminded him that minds could change when hearts were open. The story of the German women POWs and the black medics of the 382nd never appeared in official military histories. It was too small a narrative in the vast chronicle of World War II, too personal an experience. Amid the sweeping geopolitical transformations of the mid-20th century. But for those who lived it, the lesson remained clear. Fear built on ignorance could be dismantled by direct experience, and human connection could bridge the deepest divides created by hatred and war. When Sergeant Washington had written to Margaret in 1946 to inform her of his acceptance to complete his medical studies, she had replied with congratulations and a question that had been troubling her. How can we ensure that others learn what we learned without requiring the terrible circumstances of war to teach them? His response was characteristically thoughtful. We tell our stories. We speak truth to those who will listen. We teach the next generation to question what they are told about those who are different. And most importantly, we create opportunities for people to work together toward common goals, because it is through shared purpose that we most clearly see our shared humanity. In the decades that followed, as both America and Germany confronted their histories of racial prejudice and sought paths toward greater equality, such wisdom would prove as essential to healing societies as medical knowledge was to healing bodies. The lessons learned in a makeshift hospital in Hildesheim would be replicated countless times, wherever people found the courage to see beyond the categories they had been taught and recognize the humanity they shared. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.